Also, if you don't mind, I want to talk about the salary. Is it good enough for living or is not enough?
So being none of those things, neither white nor female, don't really fit the main criteria. So I feel like sometimes when I tell people I'm a native English teacher, they hesitate for a bit too because they have such like a set image.
But it can be a little dangerous if you just keep staying and staying and there's not a lot of purpose besides you just really enjoy and it's easy.
What's up guys, welcome back to my channel. Today I interviewed two Asian American guys who are very cool and I asked them about being a native English teacher in Korea. Hi, could you introduce yourself?
안녕하십니까. 제 이름이 Spencer입니다. Hello everyone, my name is Spencer. I am a current native English teacher in South Korea. I am from San Francisco, California.
Hi, my name is Tracy. I'm from Boston in America, and I currently live in Daejeon, Korea, and I'm a native English teacher.
Okay, so you are English teacher in Korea, right? How did you get your job you're working at right now? Like, could you tell me a little bit briefly?
Yes. I applied through a program called EPIC. Basically, it's a very invigorating process where you have to do interviews and a whole application process. After you go through the process, you get randomly placed. In a sense, you could get placed in Seoul, you could get placed in Busan, as in these big cities, or you can get even placed in very small rural towns. And I am placed in a very small rural town called Hacheon in Gangwon-do. Fun fact, it is 20 kilometers from North Korea.
Wow, that's very far from Seoul, right?
Oh, 그렇지.
Yeah.
Correct.
So after I graduated college, my friend told me about teaching abroad, and then he told me about the program EPIC, which stands for English Program in Korea. And I applied, and then I got the job, and now I'm here in Korea.
And where is your school?
So I teach at an elementary school in Daejeon. Daejeon is like literally the center of South Korea. I think it's one of the top 5 metropolitan cities too.
I heard that outside of Seoul, there's not many communities for foreigners and there's no clubs, no parties. Don't you feel lonely or bored sometimes?
That's 당연하지, of course. I think what's really tough about, especially if you're very rural, there's not a lot of, again, normal clubs like volleyball club or gyms that are bustling with a lot of young people. Or even for me, as a Christian, like a church that is English speaking, where I can actually interact with people. So it is really tough. And a phrase that I actually learned in Korean was 저는 가끔 외로워, which means I am sometimes lonely. And I really am, you know? But I think it's for every English EPIC teacher, that is a normal part of the process. And I think once you understand what it's like to be lonely, you appreciate company even more.
So Daejeon is also kind of big city in Korea, right? Yeah. So is there any like good communities for foreigners and some parties or clubs?
I would say prior to coming to Korea, I thought that Seoul was going to be the only place where people spoke English and that it was more globalized in a sense. But actually Daejeon, there's quite a good amount of people that speak English there. I've been able to like meet some friends here and there. Aside from other English teachers, I've met some friends say at like restaurants, like parties, clubs. So I feel like Daejeon's like a pretty good place for like a foreigner or like a native English teacher to be at.
So as an Asian American, what is it like being a native English teacher in Korea?
저는 중국이 미국이에요. So I am Chinese American. That's a great question. I appreciate that because I think it's a perspective that is not as common in the English program world. Many English teachers or 원어민 선생님, native English teachers are usually blonde, blue eyes, Caucasian. One thing that is tough is that people tend to think that we're Korean. Students, especially again, if you're East Asian, it's even more, but they will naturally talk more Korean to you. They honestly sometimes won't give you as much grace, even when you're teaching or even when you're out in public because they expect you to know Korean. Because as someone who looks Korean, they think that you know it and are one of them. So it's a positive and a negative, I like to say a double-edged sword.
I heard that most of the academies and schools, when they're looking for native English teachers, they want people who don't look like a Korean. They're looking for someone who look like a foreigner, right?
As well as even the teaching academies, they do tend to want to have teachers who appear more foreign as opposed to hiring somebody who may look Korean to teach English, because it goes over better with the parents, supposedly.
So what is your experience or what is your thoughts about that?
Yeah. So for example, when I tell people that I am Chinese American, people do not believe me sometimes that I'm American. They're like, "말도 안 돼," like no way. There's no way that you're American. And again, it's this perspective that they think that Americans or native English speakers are always going to be blonde, blue-eye, American look, right? What's tough is that there have been stories which I've heard is where some parents and even some families, they don't take some of us Asian American teachers as seriously because they don't think that we are that traditional mold of what a native English teacher should look like and is like. So it can be very tough, and I think that, again, it's a double-edged sword for us in terms of having that gift of looking Korean but not being Korean.
There's definitely a set image that students and Korean people have of a native English teacher, and it's typically, to put it simply, maybe like a white male or a white female. And usually I feel like most of the teachers here are female. So being none of those things, neither white nor female, don't really fit the main criteria. So I feel like sometimes when I tell people I'm a native English teacher, they hesitate for a bit too, because they have such like a set image. Also feel that being an Asian American, even though I'm not Korean, I feel that if you're Asian and you're in a classroom in Korea, they expect you to speak Korean. So that's not good when I try to conduct the class in only English to give the students as much as they can in the class. But I feel like it's kind of good because I feel like in roles like this, you know, it's always good for like any role in general to really promote like diversity. So I feel like it's good that the students are being exposed to someone out of the norm. It's also good because when they grow up later in life, they'll be more willing to engage in English conversations with different people because they've been exposed to different kinds of teachers.
Also, if you don't mind, I want to talk about the salary. Is it good enough for living or is not enough?
Yeah, so in terms of the salary, I would say it's just enough to stay afloat. You're not going to be living paycheck to paycheck in terms of like you'll be at zero every time. But I will say this, and this is I think is really important. I would say it takes almost 5 to 6 months to finally start earning a little bit. And I know it sounds crazy, but there's so many expenses in the beginning where you're paying like, again, like setting up accounts and buying like even furniture and just other things like basic essentials, buying cooking pans, buying bags of rice. And so it does take a long time to adjust in terms of starting to earn. But with that said, you earn enough where you can enjoy yourself. Like I said, you can go to a concert, you can eat your favorite barbecue once a week. It's not like you are making nothing, but I will say that it can be hard to continue to make more. Again, it also depends on your lifestyle too. But
I would say for the salary, it's good enough to get by, but depending on the kind of person you are, you could save a little bit or you could be in the negatives after each month. So with the salary, I'll be pretty transparent. It's stuff you could find online too, so it's not a secret. The average salary for a native English teacher, like starting with like minimal experience, is usually around 2 million won. That's around $1,400 US a month. And obviously it's not the most amount, but the thing with the EPIK program is when you're an English teacher with EPIK, you do get rent-free housing. So usually people's biggest expense every month or in a year is rent. So, you know, you're not paying that. So as long as you're cooking and using your money wisely, taking public transportation, you can save a bit.
Then, like compared to teaching in academy, like is it less or like is it kind of similar?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I feel that the academies, the starting salary is usually a bit higher and the range is higher too. So there's more room for growth in academies. Whereas if in public schools, if you keep working more years, you'll get a raise after every year, but I think it's a lot lower than the raise that you'll get at an academy.
And I'm not in that sense of because I am a negative person. I'm actually a very positive, optimistic person. But I will say, I think the thing that really speaks to me a lot is the plateau aspect and in terms of staying very stagnant in South Korea as an English teacher. Once you start teaching English in Korea, there's many people who tell themselves, okay, they're like, oh, I'm only gonna teach 1 year, just 1 year. And then you find yourself 6, 7, 8 months in, you're like, okay, I've made some friends here. I really enjoy the food. I get to see my favorite K-pop stars like a few hours away. And then you're like, well, I'll just do 1 more year. You keep saying that, You don't have a job lined up? I'll just teach another year. 5, 6, 7 years go by, and you've been here for 7 years. And again, I'm just not saying that that's bad in any way. I think being an English teacher is respectable and very rewarding. But it can be a little dangerous if you just keep staying and staying and there's not a lot of purpose besides you just really enjoy and it's easy. Not saying that enjoyment is bad, but just be careful. 조심해요, 주세요. Just be a little careful. If you do come here and teach English, that unless teaching is your long-term plan, then I think 1 to 2 years, I think, is the right amount of time.
Despite of all of that, like you said, it has been great experience and you're enjoying your time in Korea. So what's the good things about teaching English in Korea?
I would say one thing is that it's extremely rewarding. Again, as someone who came from a sales background, I can confidently say that I'd much rather be enriching children's lives and helping them learn one of the most beautiful languages in the world than telling someone, oh, you have to buy my product. Every day when I get that one little student that says, teacher, I like English because of you, right? Or another student saying, I'm so excited for the ABCs. It's those little things that make you realize, like, wow, like even if they forget who I am in the future, that I can impart a gift of loving a language. So I would say that's by far the most rewarding thing.
Yes, I would say there's a lot of good things about teaching English in Korea. I mean, one, you're in Korea, you know, you're in one of the most poppin' countries in the world. I mean, everyone wants to go visit Korea these days because of, you know, the K-wave, the good food. Also, if you're an English teacher in Korea and you work at a public school, like through EPIK, you get rent-free housing too, which is super dope because rent can be really expensive. And another thing too is that the job is really meaningful. Like compared to the regular 9-to-5 corporate job, sometimes it might not be as fulfilling or as meaningful. But here, it's really personally fulfilling for me when I get to see the students, I'm teaching them something. They get to use the words and the sentences right away. So, you know, I have an immediate impact on them right away. I can see it. And then it's also a long-term impact too, because these students, they're going to be using that English, you know, like next year. It's going to help them engage in English conversations with people when they grow up. So when they see a foreigner or they see someone that just speaks English, they won't be hesitant to talk to them. They'll be able to do that. And it'll give them the confidence to maybe go abroad with their English and get jobs abroad.
There must be a lot of people who want to come to Korea and teaching English in Korea. So what would you say to them? Like, any advice or tips?
Yeah, I would say one really small advice first is come to Korea already knowing a little bit of Korean. Your experience will be a lot more beneficial if you can speak a little bit. And I'm not saying you have to be fluent. A few basic phrases, a few basic expressions will go a long way and show that you actually care about the language and care about interacting with people. Another thing that I would highly recommend is go with an open mind. You will get placed anywhere, especially if you go through EPIK. If you go through a Hagwon, you can get placed immediately in Seoul or a big city. But again, as someone who is in a very rural, small town, I don't even have a subway line. I have to take buses all the time even to get to subways. I just would really recommend, wherever you're placed, make the most out of it. I love, and I'm so thankful that I'm even placed in my small town now. I've met some amazing people. I've met students that are just so kind, so sweet. There's gonna be wonderful things about your town, whether you know it or not. Like for example, Hachon is famous for a huge ice fishing festival. I literally went ice fishing and ate fish. So,
for some tips and advice, learning some Korean is super useful. I would also say like some basic Korean is kind of like almost required too. If you're placed in Seoul, you might get lucky. You don't really need too much Korean to get around in Seoul because it's pretty English friendly. But if you're in other places like say, I don't know where I am, Daejeon, it's somewhat English friendly, but you definitely need some Korean to get around. And also with the EPIK job, you don't get to choose where you're placed. It's kind of random. You get to put down a preference, but it's not guaranteed. So if you're placed somewhere like in the rural or someplace that doesn't speak a lot of English, it's going to be really hard to get adjusted to Korea if you don't know any Korean. So I would say while you're preparing your application to come to Korea, study some Korean because it's really going to make a difference when you get here. It's going to be super convenient when you go to maybe the grocery market or when you're ordering food or when you're talking to people.
Okay, so this is it for today's interview. Yeah, thank you for your time and have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you.
시간 소중해요 줘서 감사합니다.
감사합니다.
제 이름이 수펜서입니다. Oh wait, no, I forgot to say hello. I forgot to say hello. Sorry, now this is more staged. I forgot.